Hi, everyone. Thank you. I'm too tall for these mics. Thank you very much. Thank you, Pia, for chairing so effectively. Thank you, Jim, for the kind invitation, and of course, François, for hosting us. So we're presenting the chapter on Greece and Turkey, which is a new chapter for this edition of the volume. We called it as a subtitle, From State Building and Developmentalism to Diversification and Crisis Management. Hopefully this indicates that we view this chapter as an intellectual exercise where we compare these two countries in a longue durée approach, going back historically, to see, not to give you more data, so this is not going to be a data-rich presentation, but a presentation that will try to essentially identify, firstly, whether we can contextualize recent policy responses to migration by looking more broadly on how these two states dealt with mobility historically, and also whether we should problematize terms such as latecomers or such as crisis, migration and refugee crisis, given the history of migration in that part of the Eastern Mediterranean. But also a part of this intellectual exercise for us was to sort of understand whether, how, and why we could compare these two countries, which was initially an idea that Jim put forth. And of course, as far as I'm aware, this is the first attempt to compare Greece and Turkey in terms of their migration practices, because these two countries are rarely put in comparative context. But the more we read and the more we discussed this, we saw that actually there's very many things that can be said about the tight connections that the two countries have. Familiar images on the top in terms of the responses to the refugee crisis in the last few years, but also something that goes back to the Germany discussion earlier today about both states sending guest workers to Western Europe, Germany, and elsewhere in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. But we argue we can go even further back and look at population exchanges in the 1920s that also serve to link these two states together. So that's our starting point.
Okay, so as Gerasimos mentioned, we've been engaged with a dialogue with Jim about his notion of the migration state, which what we're trying to do here is argue that actually it is useful to use the concept of the migration state for countries such as Greece and Turkey, but we need to amend it. That the starting point for the migration state concept has been North America and Europe. And in order to understand countries like Greece and Turkey, we have to think of the migration state beyond the liberal migration state. Now, Greece and Turkey are put in the latecomers section. And yesterday we had a discussion about classifications and looking at the US, Canada, and Australia as nations of immigration or settler states. Well, both Greece and Turkey are what you could call post-imperial states. They were both part of the Ottoman Empire. And so we use a template to structure the empirics of the chapter, starting with this idea of the nationalizing migration state. So migration isn't new in these two states, but it's played a different role in state formation and nation building. So we first look at the nationalizing migration state in the two cases. Then we look, as Gerasimos said, at the role of emigration in the developmental state in the two cases. And then we look at what we're calling the neoliberal migration state, or migration in the neoliberal context. I see Christian Yapka's left. We were hoping to get some of his reaction on this, but those are the three sections in the paper.
So how does this work empirically? Well, going to Greece first, well, in terms of the nationalizing migration state, this is a process that has been explored by a number of scholars theoretically from Ari Zolberg on, and we identify in the paper 3 ways through which migration was used for nationalizing purposes in the context of the Greek modern state. that emerges in the 1830s as an ethnically diverse state out of the Ottoman Empire. And there's three strategies that state makers pursued. Firstly, we have a violent process of dislocation and disenfranchisement domestically of non-ethnic Greek populations that involve violence, that involves forced expulsions, even state-led Hellenization processes such as granting financial incentives to Muslim citizens of the new state in order to convert to Orthodox Christianity and to gain the name the Neophyte, or processes that are much more long-term, such as educational processes that aim to assimilate these non-ethnic Greek populations into this context. A second process has to do with targeted dispossession of population groups outside state boundaries. So the fledgling Greek state actually sends people abroad, namely to Ottoman Macedonia, in an effort to compete with Bulgaria and Serbia in claiming that part of the Ottoman Empire that was to create a number of problems later on in the 20th century. And finally, and perhaps most well known, these population resettlement strategies are something that the Greek state did engage in and support, not only with Turkey, as Fiona will explain in a minute, but also with other states such as Serbia and Bulgaria in 1919. So we have, by the end of this long century, the creation of a Greek state that was at the beginning very, very ethnically diverse to becoming one of the most ethnically homogeneous countries in the Balkans.
Okay, so one sees a similar process in Turkey, although it happens later. One can even look at the late Ottoman Empire, the kind of Armenian expulsions and genocide as being the beginnings of this nationalizing process. But as Gerasimos mentioned, we see when Turkey was founded in the 1920s, that you have a major population exchange between Greece and Turkey. This is part of also an internal Turkification process within Turkey, but it also included immigration. So immigration in the early Republican period was used as a way of homogenization. So about 700,000 Muslim migrants from the Balkans in the early Republican period. But I think you can't put a strict time limit on this because you also had the expulsion of Greek populations in the 1960s. And you could even arguably say that the exodus of Kurdish exiles and activists after the 1980 the military coup, is part of this nationalizing process. It also plays into, the Kurdish conflict in the southeast region of Turkey and so forth.
So the similarities with which the two states engaged in nationalization via migration extend to the use of migration for developmental purposes, particularly in the post-World War II period. In Greece, this is part of the national history in the sense that from 1945 onwards, particularly up until 1973-74, roughly 1 in 6 Greek citizens emigrated and pursued employment abroad. And of course, the argument that all states are migration states is valid and we take it to heart. What we argue is that we can actually trace the emergence of the developmental migration state when we look at state policies. So for the Greek state, from 1955 onwards, we have a distinct decision to begin collecting statistical data on emigration. But also, and more famously, we have the conducting of a number of bilateral labor agreements, West Germany being the most prominent, but also France and Belgium, leading to over 1 million Greek citizens emigrating in these almost 20 years. And of course, this is something that was countenanced after 73, after the end of the Trente Glorieuses or the Wirtschaftswunder, with the wave of return migration in Greece, and slowly the beginning of the realization by Greek officials that there is something to be said about managing these large groups of labor migrants and diasporas abroad. And this ties into the use of diasporas as instruments of development as well. So this is broadly how the developmental state in Greece functions.
Okay, a very similar process, but again later in Turkey. So in Turkey you had the first bilateral recruitment agreement with Germany in 1961, where German firms came to Istanbul and recruited workers directly. This was really part of Turkey's import substitution industrialization model, where emigration was used as a way of reducing domestic unemployment. It was seen as a safety valve. And also it played a key role in terms of remittances. At some point in the 1970s, 70% of foreign currency earnings were coming from remittances. And also, I think it's important to mention in the context of Phil's presentation and others, when we talk about integration in Germany, that throughout this period, the Turkish state also played an important role in managing they were still Turkish citizens. So the immigrants and quote guest workers in the early days were Turkish citizens, and the Turkish state actually had engaged with Turkish communities through various management policies, such as sending imams and teachers and so forth. And Turks would register at their local consulate in Europe and so forth. So a lot of similarities between Greece and Turkey in terms of the use of emigration as a development strategy, but again, Turkey is a bit later than Germany.
Greece.
Greece, sorry.
And finally, the third dimension of migration state in the two cases has to do with what we argue is the neoliberal migration state. And this is something that we're still thinking through, so we would value any feedback on what you think on that. Of course, in the last 20 years, Greece, much like Italy and Spain, has experienced a diversification of migration flows and the direct involvement of external actors in the management of both migration and forced migration, something that probably Laila is going to talk about in terms of the EU after us as well. What we want to focus on is this neoliberal dimension of this that has to do with the commodification of migration, or the instrumental use of migration for economic purposes. One of the things that we argue has to do with this use of refugees as rent, as economic rent, and we see this in Greece with the ruling left-wing party, the Syriza party, actually trying to instrumentalize the refugee crisis in order to gain a better deal in the EU bailout negotiations. So we have a lot of threats taking place there in terms of opening the borders or letting refugees into Western Europe. A second example that shows this shift towards neoliberalism in the migration management of the Greek state has to do with the implementation of this golden visa program, a decision to grant permanent residency to property investors if they are able to invest some 250,000 euros to the Greek property market. And this is a distinctly neoliberal instrument if you take into account that this is not something that benefits the Greek state directly. This is something that benefits essentially the market, property investors the property market in Greece that aims to benefit from this inflow of cash. And up until today, we have approximately 10,000 permits being granted, particularly from Chinese, Turkish, and Russian property buyers. So we see a shift from the initial sort of use of migration as a nationalizing instrument to a very neoliberal management of migration and citizenship today, leading to some 1.5 billion euros having been invested into the Greek real estate market.
Okay, and just a note on that, it's ironic in some ways because some of the golden visas in Greece are being taken up by Turkish citizens who are leaving Turkey and buying homes in Athens and then either commuting to Turkey or trying to escape the political situation. In terms of Turkey, there's a lot to say here. We talk in the paper about the increasing diversification and globalization of migration to Turkey. So in the 2000s, there were visa-free regimes with, for example, Georgia. And you have circulation of migrants from Georgia. You have immigrants from the former Soviet Union. You also have a transnationalization where you have Filipino workers. You have African migrants, either Turkey as a destination state or as a transit state. This is partly due to Turkey's investment in the African continent. Turkey even sponsors an annual conference for the Somali diaspora. So you see this globalization of different flows of migration. Now, of course, the big thing in Turkey is the Syrian refugee crisis, and Turkey is, host to more refugees than any other state in the world. 3.5 million Syrians approximately in Turkey, more Syrians in Istanbul than all of Europe. We look a lot at the politics of this and also the domestic politics of this, but one of the points we wanted to raise was to tie it to its position on the southern border of Europe. And we think we can make a case of neoliberal pressures coming from Europe as Europe tries to restrict migration and externalizes both to private companies inside of Europe in terms of detention centers, but also outside its borders. Turkey becomes, a sort of almost a holding space for refugees to prevent them from getting to Europe. And we look at the negotiations between Turkey and the EU, and Turkey manages to get 6 billion euros. And this is all kind of in reaction to Europe's interest in preventing migration. Turkey also has a citizenship by investment scheme. There you see a poster in the new airport in Istanbul. Buy a property in Istanbul and automatically receive Turkish citizenship. And this scheme has actually been taken up by wealthier Syrian refugees as kind of an avenue into membership if you have the resources for it. So just to conclude, what we try to show in the paper is that both Greece and Turkey have very similar migration state trajectories over time. There are differences in timing with Greece, developments in Greece going earlier and then Turkey later. The domestic contexts are clearly different. But we also want to emphasize the relationship to Europe. I think in some of the other cases, there's this idea that there's complete autonomy over migration policy. But here, geopolitics and the pressures coming from Europe, whether it's the nation-state model in the 1920s, whether it's the pool for emigration in the 50s and 60s, or now the current, quote, refugee and migration crisis, Turkey and Greece are both affected by what's going on in Europe. So we hope this overview provides an interesting comparative perspective and also stimulates some discussion on categories of latecomer and crisis by looking at a broader perspective. Okay, thank you. Thank you.